Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan, and in one of our recent videos, one of the commenters asked this question. They basically are asking, now that the Mandalorians are unified, what kind of government can we expect to be established on Mandalore? How will they safeguard this very small foothold they have on the planet and grow as a people, a nation, and planet? Well, that's exactly the type of thought exercise I enjoy doing the most. So let's take a look. I think when the commenter writes not just another generic democracy, what they're meaning is like a direct democracy. One person gets one vote and you pretty much vote for every issue. It's a very extreme form of democracy and governance. It's kind of like what we see on Pleasure 15 with Jack Black and Lilo. There are a lot of obvious problems and pitfalls with this method of governance, as Christopher Lloyd points out. Although he was a Dooku truther, so we gotta be careful about him.
I support democracy. I enforce it.
One of those issues is the tyranny of the majority. What if you're one of the Mandalorians who really likes using disruptor rounds because it reduces cleanup time in your jobs and induces fear into the hearts of your enemies? But what if the majority of Mandalorian society suddenly votes to ban the disruptor rifle because it's messed up to use them on organics, or more realistically, they just don't trust you waving that thing around with them on missions, which is why Steve's no longer here, and all we have left of Steve is his helmet. If you're in the minority about any issue, even disruptor rifles, you might just be completely out of luck and never have the ability to find some way to have a voice. Then there's tyranny of the uninformed. Everyone thought that the planet Mandalore was cursed within the Children of the Watch thanks to the armor. And maybe if they had voted on whether they should return to the planet, the majority of people might have voted not to because, again, it's toxic and poisoned. It's possible that the Children of the Watch would have never returned to Mandalore if they were a direct democracy. Obviously, democracies function much better in real life, and that is because there are very few direct democracies in this world. When we say democracy, we often mean interchangeably representative democracies, which have checks and balances, other kind of systems that can expedite governing in case of emergencies. But in all honesty, looking at how few Mandalorians there are, governance is considerably easier in smaller groups like this. Even more extreme forms of governing, like a direct democracy, have a better shot of being functional in these smaller settings. For instance, the early kibbutzim settlements created in the years before Israel's foundation were very socialist in nature. All the adult parents would work together equally, and the kids were raised and protected communally. This worked relatively well because people had no other choice. There's no infrastructure, no food, and oftentimes there were security issues with neighboring villages and tribes. Some of the kibbutzim were also inspired by ancient Spartan civics, especially when it came to communal living, discipline, and education. But more importantly, these communities were so small that every member of a kibbutz pretty much knew each other. Each person was held responsible for the work by peer pressure and also that underlying need to survive. The backbreaking work equalized everyone. Now you scale up something like that to a societal level, like how that asshat Mao did with the Great Leap Forward in the 50s, and you're talking about over 15 to 50 million deaths within a 4-year period, mostly caused by famine. That rivals all of the World War II casualties combined. Here's some pictures of Mao's famous countryside furnaces, where farmers were implored to make weapons-grade steel for China's supposed economic and military miracle. Instead, they were just melting down their useful farm tools and turning them into pig iron. Because they were farmers and not professional steelworkers or arms manufacturers. Plus, the only people who knew the science behind advanced steelworking were bougie and therefore enemies of the revolution. F***ing assholes. Mandalore needs to take that into account. What works right now for their society might not scale up properly when more and more Mandalorians in exile return and their people become demographically more diverse and plentiful. At one point, you'll need more than just casual knife fights to settle disputes. For any society to function properly, you need a strong and independent judicial system that could set the rules of the land and enforce them. This is to keep all those psychopaths and sociopaths who have been preying on civilized human society since the beginning of humanity. Without this judicial infrastructure in place, you can't grow civilizations, you cannot grow economies, you can't grow anything. The Mandalorians historically have relied on a group of individuals known as the Mandalorian Protectors. During the new Mandalorian period, they served as Duchess Satine's royal guard and police. When the Empire took over, they went into exile on the moon of Concordia and protected that sector from incursions. Now, the Protectors had one problem. They swore direct loyalty to the Mandalore, aka the executive branch. This is problematic because what stops the Mandalore from using the Protectors as their own private army to enforce their more dictator-like tendencies. I mean, this is why most dictators in real life have their own private military force which is loyal directly to them and competes for resources with the national military. The Protectors should become an independent branch of Mandalorian society, focused solely on codifying Mandalorian traditions into law and protecting that law. These Protectors need to be completely isolated from partisan politics within Mandalorian society and again focused only on upholding the law. Plus, the only thing that is going to be able to police a bunch of badass Mandalorians are the most badass Mandalorians in the first place. And judging by the characters of individuals like Fen Ra, who mentored Sabi and Ren on wielding the Darksaber but never sought power for himself, I think the Protectors have a rich culture of preserving Mandalorian culture and not seizing power, which I think is incredibly important for this very powerful but independent branch of the government. Now, every government also needs to take into account the cultural factors of the demographics that they are ruling. I mean, no two authoritarian states are the same and no two democracies are the same. The original founding fathers of the United States were mainly Protestant Christians, but many, including George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin, practiced theistic rationalism rather than deism, which more adheres to a blind belief in orthodoxy and values individual interpretation of the scriptures much less. This is probably what led to the belief amongst the founding fathers that America should not have a Christian government or a religious government, but a country that is inspired by morality that is commonly found within religion. This is also why in the United States, religious freedom is incredibly important to the central tenets of our Constitution and our culture. Many of the founding fathers were only a few generations removed from refugees escaping religious persecution, and of course the massive hordes of undead that could be found all across Europe at the time. The individuals who wrote the American Constitution all came from a pretty similar background, and despite this being a very religious nation, it's also a nation that has clear separations between religion and state. This enlightened view of religion and governance is something that was very prevalent amongst the founding fathers, and this is why to this day, despite being a very religious country, we maintain those separations between church and state in this country. The Mandalorians also have their own cultural advantage, but more as a martial people. They have a huge advantage when it comes to developing their security infrastructure for this reason. Most nations have to consciously create the structure and training for a national military force and create professional soldiers who form the backbone of any military. For the Mandalorians, being a professional soldier is a part of their way of life. Without any urging from the central government, every Mandalorian is prepared for war and defense naturally because of the culture. In times of crisis, a Mandalore simply needs to have the blessing and trust of his people, and the entire population can be quickly mobilized for warfare. In this way, Mandalorian society functions like one large militia. You have a bunch of people who are able to be called up for military duty, but they also have their own civilian lives that are separate from military life. Although it should be mentioned that most of these civilians either kill or hunt things for a living anyway. And so, should the nation ever need them, the Mandos can quickly be organized into battalions, climb into dropships, and fly off to war. Mandalorians even naturally assume a chain of command by usually deferring or electing the most experienced member amongst them to leadership positions. This creates NCOs at smaller unit levels and officers at platoon and company levels organically. I mean, never have people been more eager or more willing or more prepared to be turned into an active military fighting force. And unlike your usual territory defense or militias, these Mandos come bringing all of their own tools and vehicles and crazy hardware. And you wouldn't have to use these guys just in, like limited defensive operations. They'll actually be offended if you don't carry out the fight to the enemy eventually. And I don't know, perpetuate some massacres, maybe like ride and enslave sentient species until they lose their sentience, that kind of stuff. Although Jason Muriel, the true Mandalorians from Legends, would probably have the Protectors coming along with the war parties as sort of military police so they can rein in the Vizslas from, doing too many war crimes. Now, a far more efficient form of governance than a direct democracy is a representative democracy, which can come in the form of a Senate or a parliament. But essentially, you have a group of elected officials that carry out the political will of a much larger group that votes for them. These lawmakers are supposed to completely focus on policy making so that the average person can focus on their everyday life instead of, very specific and mundane and specific policy that they might not have an opinion about or might not have the expertise to actually make any judgment about. Like the federal regulation on percentage of pure Beskar in an alloy for it to be considered illegal for export. I'm sure there's a Senate subcommittee of Mandalorians that will interview all the armorers and her kin to figure out what qualifies as a Beskar alloy or just a metal that might have some small fragments of Beskar in it. The point is, you don't need everyone in this conversation. They definitely also don't want the Empire making cheap knockoffs of their armor that would not only offend their gods, but also destroy the legendary image of this very important suit of armor that surely increases bounty hunting fees for Mandalorians all across the galaxy. Now, within representative democracies, what usually organically happens is a further separation or organization of the political system into individual parties and groups. Now, when I say this, a lot of people think about the chaos of the American bipartisan system, Democrats versus Republicans, or the more diverse multi-party parliamentary systems we see in Europe that are also extremely chaotic. But consider the alternative. China calls itself the People's Republic, and by that it means they have a republic with one single party that doesn't allow anyone else to share power with it, the Chinese Communist Party, and this essentially creates tyranny. So having multiple parties is actually essential to having a functional democracy. Plus, even if the CCP does ban political parties, there's plenty of internal factionalism that are just human nature anyway. And while party politics can be toxic, at the same time, having large voting blocks allows you to expedite bills that might need to be passed for reform reasons. Generally, in the infancy of a democratic system, like the one we potentially could be seeing here on Mandalore, political squabbling initially is offset by the intense desire to get stuff done by all parties involved, which itself is usually inspired by the huge amount of things that need to be done. The entire planet of Mandalore is a wreck. George Washington and Mon Mothma's first 2 terms as, the executive of their government was met with political unity and a lack of partisan squabbling. But the second these 2 stepped down, that's when political parties began to form. It's also when the Chaos Demons first began making forays from the unholy northern wastelands otherwise known as Canada. Now, in Mandalorian society, thanks to clans and houses, you already have a natural organization. A clan like Clan Kryze or Clan Vizsla is a family or bloodline. A house like House Kryze and House Vizsla is a larger political movement that is started by a clan but also includes other clans beneath its political umbrella. Clan Ren, for instance, was loyal to House Vizsla during the Clone Wars. And so a house is already a political organization, and I think they might actually threaten the young political system we're trying to set up here. And that's because these houses are tied directly to family and bloodlines instead of political ideology or belief system. You can't really compromise on what it means to be a part of a family or bloodline. Those things are set in stone. And so the risk of the Mandalorian political system turning into a self-service democracy where one only votes for their own people's welfare instead of the welfare of everyone is actually pretty great here. But Mandalores in Mandalorian history traditionally bring all the houses together underneath one larger tent. And so Bo-Katan has the ability here to unify her people and perhaps destroy this old notion of houses and political parties. Ideally, Bo-Katan can break apart some of the more important houses and instead create a unity government and encourage the creation of true political parties that are built along policy and ideological lines and interests rather than what your granddaddy's last name was.
Din Djarin took the creed and chose to walk the way, just as our ancestors did.
So we've discussed a lot about the individual attributes of what's needed in a strong, stable government that creates a strong, stable society. But all of this only works when governance is built on mutual trust for one another all throughout that society. There needs to be some central values and tenets that everyone can agree on. It can be something as vague and simple as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or the way of the Mandalore. This is why I believe Bo-Katan and Din Djarin are so important for this period in Mandalorian history. I think both individuals really do understand that it's important to get all these Mandalorians to put aside their differences and find commonality so that they can create a strong foundation for a new future Mandalore. Let me know in the comment sections below what you think about my analysis here, and as usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy.